Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., environmental lawyer and activist who is, of course, seeking the Democratic nomination for president. Mr. Kennedy, good to see you.
Very good to be here with you, Diane.
So, where are you? Are you joining us from the West Coast right now? Give us some sense of place, because
I'm in my I'm in my office in Brentwood, California, and I've been here for now about 5 days, and then I go back on the road. Tomorrow I go back to South Carolina,
which is a perfect segue because I saw your recent press release you put out, and I think a lot of people are discussing as we head into primary season. What do you make of the DNC calendar?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that the DNC does not want a primary. I don't want to say that they want a coronation, but that's I think that's a fair way to put it. Actually, they're doing they're essentially they're fixing the process so that it makes it almost impossible to have democracy function. They're effectively disenfranchising the Democratic voters from having any choice in who becomes president or who becomes the Democratic nominee. So two of the things they've done to date is they've moved the Iowa primary. They've made rules that if anybody campaigns in Iowa or any candidate sets foot in the state of Iowa or sets foot in the state of New Hampshire, then none of the votes that are cast for that candidate will be tallied. In other words, any delegate that I win in New Hampshire or Iowa would go instead to the president. And now they're trying to change it so that if I campaign in New Hampshire, that none of the votes cast for me in Georgia will count. And that's significant because it's hard to win the nomination without Georgia.
What is the logic?
Well, they're rigging it so that effectively, we're looking at the tabulations now that look like if you add up all the super delegates that they control and all of the automatic delegates that just go to the party and go to the president, I would have to win almost 80% of all of the states in order to beat President Biden, even if he only wins 20%.
And yet you continue on. So what is your strategy then in light of this for defeating President Biden?
These rules will not be finalized until September 14th, and we've written the DNC protesting. I mean, there's some really wild things that they're now considering, including forcing me to actually pay for the primaries. And their logic is that they don't need a primary because they already have a candidate. And therefore, I'm costing them all this money, and that money should be paid for by me and, maybe Marianne Williamson. So it's not, it's a process that is rigged. And we live at a time in American history when a lot of Americans think that democracy is broken, that the political system is rigged, and that there's not really any democracy. And unfortunately, the DNC is taking a lot of steps that confirm that outlook.
You mentioned you're going to South Carolina. How is this impacting your strategy around Iowa and New Hampshire in light of what the new DNC rules are?
Well, I'm campaigning in those states, so I'm going to continue to campaign in those states. Those are important states for the American democracy. They're really the only states that really require you to do retail politics, to go to the barbershops, the nail salons, the diners, to meet people on the street, and to actually talk to voters other than just donors. the other states, are content with having candidates kind of aerial bombard them from 30,000 feet with advertising that is, the DNC has $2 billion now in their bank account. That's all, all given by, or most of it given by large donors, and that they can use that money to do slick campaign ads, and President Biden will not actually ever have to meet a donor. And then they have occasionally, maybe he'll do a rally in which they're very heavily orchestrated, in which everybody who goes to that rally is screened, and there's nothing unexpected, and there's no unscripted contact with voters. And I don't think that's good for democracy if the only people that President Biden is talking to is his donors. Because then he's living in a bubble, and he's living in a bubble where he's only talking to very, very wealthy Americans who aren't enduring many of the hardships that are facing the majority of the people in this country. That 57% of the people in this country can't put their hands on $1,000 if there's an emergency in their lives. That means if the engine light comes on in their car, they don't have them pay for it. And I think the president and President Trump or whoever are the candidates on the Republican side ought to be talking to those people and understanding, because both President Trump and President Biden are saying that they're running on the record of prosperity that they've left to this country. And what I'm doing, traveling around this country and actually talking to people, I'm not seeing Americans, when they hear that, they feel like they're being gaslighted, because they're not living in happy days are here again. They're watching kids who cannot buy a home.
It's interesting. With your fundraising, you seem to be drawing support from both GOP and Democratic donors. What do you make of that?
I think that's a good thing. I mean, what I set out to do from the beginning is to find a middle ground where I focus on the values that we all share in common, rather than the issues that are driving Americans apart, and to try to heal the divide and find a way that where we can overcome this toxic polarization. And if you look at the crowds that are coming to I'm getting bigger crowds than any candidate except for Trump, and the crowds that are coming are split between independents, Democrats, and Republicans. My donors are split between independents, Republicans, and Democrats, and I think that's a healthy thing for a healthy sign.
We've talked about the DNC. There's also, I know there's been some discussion around, whether you're getting the sort of security protection that candidates would normally get. Talk a little bit about that, and do you feel this orchestrated campaign to basically marginalize you?
Yeah, I mean, I do. And it's not only by the DNC, but also the press. My numbers are putting me at the third spot after President Trump and President Biden, and my favorability numbers are better than any candidate. But I'm not allowed on CNN. I'm not allowed on MSNBC. They will interview Nikki Haley, who has a tiny fraction of the vote count that I have, or Vivek, or Governor DeSantis, or any of these other candidates who have only a fraction of the support that I have. And yet, when the press talks about me, it's they always use the word long shot candidate before they talk about me. They don't do that with other people who are running today. They give them kind of a fair shake. But
I want to get a sense of, if the decision holds for the current, sort of primary structure with the DNC, what is the route to victory for you against President Biden?
Oh, if the DNC is going to rig it so that it is simply impossible for anybody to challenge President Biden, then I need to look at other alternatives because I can't go back to the people support me and to my donors and say, I'm in this to make a point. I need to show them a road to victory.
What kind of alternatives would you be exploring, Mr. Kennedy?
Well, I don't know exactly because I want to see what the DNC does. I want to see if they make it if they make it a fair contest. And I'm not asking that it be 100% fair, but I'm asking that there at least be, a chance that it be plausible for somebody else to win other than their, chosen anointed candidate.
In a scenario of President Trump, Cornel West is in the picture, President Biden, let's assume, who would you support in that scenario, or who would you want to be aligned with?
Well, I don't have like a plan B, and I intend to be a candidate myself, so I'm gonna support myself.
I guess one way to put I'm curious about your thoughts on the indictments against President Trump, because it speaks to some of the other issues you've talked about. I mean, do you think that it is fair, the cases against him and the timing of those cases?
I don't talk about those, about either, the indictments on either side or the impeachment efforts on either side, because what I'm trying to focus on, Diane, is the values that hold us together, rather than these issues that are inflammatory and that keep us apart. And frankly, anybody I have no insider's view of what's happening with those indictments. I think any Americans can look at them, can read up on them, and make up their own mind about whether or not they think that they're fair or prudent. So I don't need to get into that.
That's fair. No, I think it speaks in part, Mr. Kennedy, to the issue of trust that I know you've spoken about in the past, and is certainly something that's resonating on the campaign trail. I mean, I guess one question that I am curious about is whether you, for example, would go back to Congress, give more testimony, if you have any views of just the current roster that is in the House, and who do you admire among that group?
Well, I will talk to Congress anytime that they want me to testify. The last time I went up there, it was a very strange situation, as you saw. But we need to respect the democratic institution in this country. We need to fortify them right now. There are so many threats to our democracy out there, and particularly with the emergence of all these new technologies that like AI technology and all these surveillance technologies. We live in a time where we really need to be bolstering the institutions of our democracy rather than disrespecting them or tearing them down. So, of course, if Congress asks me, I'm going to go testify.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your policies. Let's take the border, for example. Where you differentiate from what President Biden is doing and where you agree, but let's look, what would you be doing differently with the U.S. economy right now?
Well, on the border, I would not be having an open border. There have been, the border, I've been to the border and I've watched what's going on there, and it's shocking. The border, we've turned our immigration policy over in this country to the Mexican drug cartels. And I watch bus after bus owned by the cartels coming up to the border wall and letting each one of them 55 passengers. In fact, the night I was there, I saw about 300 people come across, and only 2 families were Latin American or Central American. There were one family from Peru and another from Colombia. But most of them were just from Africa and from Asia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China. And they were people, for the most part, who didn't even claim to have asylum claims. They said, when I asked, because I interviewed almost all the people who came across that night, except for the African group who came across first and were being processed by the time I got to them. And so I wasn't allowed to talk to them. It's all illegal, and yet the Mexican drug cartels are advertising all over the world saying, send us $15,000 and we will get you into the United States. And they're doing that. And the people who came across, had TikTok. They were where they'd seen the videos on TikTok and YouTube. They knew exactly what was going to happen to them. They knew the Border Patrol would process them immediately and then provide them with a plane ticket to go anywhere in the country they wanted. And it's not a good thing for our country, and it's not a good thing for them. I saw them, it's a humanitarian crisis. These people were extorted, exploited, they were robbed, raped in one case that we talked to.
You saw somebody being raped?
No, not. We never saw anybody, but we talked to people. And we visited the center and spent a half a day at the center that treats the people who've been raped on the way over, and many of them children as young as 11 years old. And there's a center in Yuma, a medical center just for children who have been sexually abused crossing the border. 85,000 children have disappeared.
Mr. Kend, I just want to double check on the border issue before we move on to some of the other issues. Does it matter where they're from? I mean, you're sort of trying to correct some misimpressions that it's all people from Latin America. Does it really matter if they're also from China and Africa and other places?
Yeah, because I think a lot of the people, the impression is that people who are coming across the border are all people from Central America and Latin America who have asylum claims, who are fleeing tyranny, oppression, murder threats in their own country for their political beliefs. And that is not what I saw. And there may be a lot of cases like that. And those people, one of the things I'll do as president is to make sure that we have enough asylum judges to adjudicate those cases fairly at the border and make sure that people who need protection are brought in, but that the people who are making frivolous claims are not allowed into our country. We need to control our borders. We need to widen the gates to make it, a path for citizenship much easier for people who are legally applying and getting in line. But we can't have the Mexican drug cartel control our immigration. And the people who I saw come across are walking into a nightmare in our country, and here's why. They're given court dates that are 7 miles in the future. For 7 years, they're going to live in our country, and they are, there's 100,000 now that have landed in New York. They're crushing the social service system in New York City. It's costing billions and billions of dollars. They're preyed upon because they don't have work papers and they can't get them over that 7-year period.
No, it is a human tragedy. I mean, it sounds in a bit like you're more aligned with the sort of GOP stance on that particular issue. Is that fair to say?
Well, whatever alignment. Listen, I work alongside with Cesar Chavez, who is my father's, strongest ally.
Right.
20 years. And he had two issues. The one I was working with him on, and I was a pallbearer in his funeral. One I was working on with pesticides. The other big issue he has was closing the border, because he saw that it was eroding the bargaining leverage for American workers. It was lowering their wages. His farm workers were being harmed by the open border policies at that time. And he was at the center of the Democratic Party, as was my father. I don't think Democrats or Republicans, are really interested traditionally in having an open border. You need, we need asylum for people around the country, that's around the world. What I'm trying to tell you is the people who are motivated by saying, these are humanitarian issues, we need to open the border to be kind to people. The people who are coming across are not being, it's not a kind atmosphere. They're landing here. They're preyed upon by unscrupulous employers who pay them $5 or $6 an hour. And they're working for food because they cannot get a place to stay. They're living on the sidewalks, working for food, lowering the wages for American workers, crushing our social safety system, and making our country less safe. It's not a good thing for anybody, including them. So maybe people who are concerned about this issue because of misogyny or xenophobia or racism or some kind of a cruel form of nationalism. But that's not where I come from. Come to this issue. I come from this issue from a humanitarian concerns and compassion.
I think that's fair. I mean, let's talk a little bit. I would like to get back a little bit to some of the just realities you're facing on the campaign trail. But I want to ask a bit more about your economic policies and where they align with what the Biden administration is doing, and how you would be different.
Well, number one, we need to end the warfare economy. We need to. So no, I'm not aligned with President Biden. President Biden's policies are, dictated by big pharmaceutical companies, by Wall Street, by the military-industrial complex, and they're keeping us in a constant state of war and allowing, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard to strip mine the wealth and the equity from the American middle class and move it upward. And I will implement the opposite of those. My policies are traditional Kennedy, FDR democratic policies that, say that the strength of our country is in a vibrant, robust middle class, is not in warfare abroad, not in creating an imperial state abroad, but creating a robust, strong industrial-based economy at home and freedom at home, rather than a surveillance state or a garrison state or a security state, which accompanies, that warfare mentality. I will wind down the empire abroad. I'm going to bring that money home. I'm going to stop building billion-dollar stealth bombers that can't fly in the rain, and instead take that money and build 1,500 schools in poor areas of this country that where we are neglecting their education, and give kids computers, make sure that teachers are adequately paid, and start rebuilding the educational infrastructure in this country, which has been allowed to deteriorate in order to pay for the wars. And that's what Martin Luther King saw.
You mentioned your family history, and
we have to choose between the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam or the war in Ukraine.
Let me just ask, one of my colleagues drew an analogy actually with Senator Eugene McCarthy. This is the stalking horse argument. And some of the, whether you think about this, basically creating an opening, LBJ dropped out and your father became the front runner. When you think about the various scenarios of how your role in this election could play out, do you think about some of those scenarios, or even whether you may create an opening for Donald Trump to win?
Well, I don't think that that's a plausible argument, because I get many more votes from President Trump and independent votes than President Biden does. Look at any of the polls that put me against Donald Trump, and I beat him handily, whereas President Biden either ties or loses. I think President Biden, 75% of the people in the country do not want him to run for president, and he will get no votes from the Republican side, whereas I get votes from everybody, from independents, Republicans, and Democrats. And I don't, I'm taking more traditionally conservative voters who will never vote for Trump. We will never vote for President Biden, but might otherwise vote for Donald Trump.
I've seen you talk about the coverage that you've received being unfair. I am curious about, do you feel the coverage about Donald Trump has been fair, or the other GOP candidates, since you're looking at the big picture here?
I don't. I think, listen, the days when the mainstream media was actually reporting news are over. News stories are now, virtually all of them are opinion pieces. And, both sides, all the media, whether it's Fox News, takes sides against the Democrats, and the mainstream media, MSNBC, CNN, and the New York Times take the side of the DNC, and they report it as if it were news. There used to be a major distinction between the news pages and the opinion pages of these organs, and what was news and what was opinion on the television networks. Now there is no distinction. Everything is opinion based. Everything is point of view based. And Americans really, one of the reasons we have this huge division in our country is nobody trusts the mainstream media anymore. And there's good reason, because, you're not getting any kind of neutral reporting of actual facts. So I see it twisted on both sides.
I think you touch a nerve that is very similar to the one that the former president also touches. And I'm curious, I'm not trying to bait you here at all, sir, is would you serve in a GOP administration, given the number of Republicans who actively support you and support your policies? I could see a scenario where you could possibly serve on either side. Is that possible?
I would doubt it, but I'm not thinking about anything. I'm not looking to get into government except if I can actually fix the government. And I think one place that I can do that from is the presidency.
And there's no other option for you to do that? I know that you don't have a plan B at the moment.
I definitely would not welcome that. And I'm not going to say that would never happen but I would never be happy. I would never be happy doing something like that. If you're talking about if somebody out, hypothetically offered me to run EPA, or HHS, would I do it? Probably not. But, I'm not going to absolutely say not. But it's not why I'm running. I'm intending to win.
I understand.
And I wouldn't want to.
You would be such a powerful force in the EPA, given your background. I'd be surprised. I bet a lot of people would welcome you in that role. But of course, we are talking about the presidency right now. I think one of the things that really resonates is just how much money you've raised. And again, from both sides, is there any total you would want to get out there now in terms of just as a show of the momentum that you have in terms of fundraising, or where it's coming from?
Well, I don't have a target like that, Diane. I think, we've raised, the campaign is doing well on fundraising, and the super PACs are, but they're never, we're never going to have the kind of money that, the DNC has. As I said, $2 billion. They're the big industries and Wall Street. This president, he's been very good to Wall Street. He's been very good to the military-industrial complex. He's been very good to the pharmaceutical industry. And they are, they're anteing up, which is what they do. So I'm not, I'm not getting money. I'm not going to get money from any of those interests. They know that I am not going to be good for them. And I think they'd pay a lot to make sure that I think the pharmaceutical industry would pay a lot of money to make sure that I don't get into office, as would the military contractors, as would the biggest, companies in the world, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, because I'm not going to be their president. I think President Biden is their president, and I want to be the president for people who don't have the lobbyists in Washington, who don't have the attorneys, and who are living paycheck to paycheck and on the edge. Those are the people I'm going to represent, and it's not going to be any good. How important
is Hollywood, Mr. Kennedy, since that's so, in my mind, associated with the Democratic campaigns? Is that an important constituency? Partly thinking of your wife here.
I would say that I don't have a lot of support. Listen, if Hollywood, if the entertainment industry took a vote today, me against President Biden, President Biden would win overwhelmingly. I have some support out here, but it's definitely not in the mainstream of the industry at this moment. I think maybe that will change, because I think a lot of the reason the opposition to me is based upon an inaccurate caricature of what I believe in, what I stand for, what I've done with my life, that is promoted ubiquitously on CNN, MSNBC, and the New York Times. And I think the more that people understand what I really stand for and what I've really done, that more and more of them will come around.
Before we go, you've mentioned Kennedy Democrat. Let's define that for people. And of course, you know, it was your father being RFK, your uncle JFK. What does that mean to you?
It means protecting the commons, you know, the air, the water, the wildlife, the fisheries, the public lands, being, you know, the Democratic Party has always been on the forefront of environmental protection, and that's where I've spent my lifetime, protecting personal autonomy, whether it's abortions or, you know, other medical mandates, anti-war, skeptical of the military-industrial complex, skeptical of the control by Wall Street titans of the American economy, schemes that shift wealth upward, freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Those are always important. The First Amendment to the Democratic Party, and civil rights and racial justice, all of those issues, and then a moral authority abroad. You know, we want Americans, or we want people who live in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, when they think of America, not to be thinking of a man with a gun, rather a Peace Corps volunteer, of engineers building bridges, roads, schools for them, and have that benevolent view of America as the, you know, leading moral authority in the globe. So those are some of the issues that I think the traditional Democratic Party, FDR, even Woodrow Wilson, but FDR, Truman, my father, my uncle, that they stood for. And that, you know, if you go down and check the box of everything my father believed in, everything JFK believed in, I think I'd check every box.
Is there a scenario, given your passion for these issues, where you might ever consider running as an independent, Mr. Kennedy, given the support you're seeing?
Only if the Democratic National Committee just makes it simply impossible for anybody to win the primary battle. That's the only way I would. I'm a Democrat. You know, I'm a lifelong Democrat. I want to, you know, my preference is to stay within the Democratic Party, as long as it's actually democratic.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Good luck on the campaign trail, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Diane.
I appreciate it.